There we go. Ooh, for a moment. Hi, I'm Majid, and I'm glad to be having this opportunity to present here. I'm going to talk about strategic design, and it's a topic that strategy and design in service is a topic that I've been talking about quite a bit. In fact, I gave a workshop recently. And I think that's the title slide I have. Oops. Okay. It's something that I practice as part of my job. A little bit about myself. I'm part of a group called Design Coders. It's a small group I started a few years ago. And as the name suggests, we're thinking about or coming up with this idea of expressing the designs of services as software. So it's almost like design expressed as code, like you think in terms of genetic code or software code. So that's really what I what I do. But I make a living as an advisor and a consultant, and I mostly work at with these two organizations. I work at the Ministry of Defense in the Netherlands, where I'm leading a small team, and we work on problems of unusual shape and size, pesky problems, difficult problems, and so we come up with new ideas or new thinking to be able to solve them. And mostly we're focusing on systems and services that fail. I'm also leading the strategic design initiative in healthcare, sponsored by Johnson & Johnson, Janssen Pharmaceuticals. And here I'm leading the strategic design of an entire new ecosystem of services, focusing on clinical trials and how to use mobile sensor technologies to create what are called digital endpoints. So these are the two things that keep me busy. And what I'm sharing with you are some of the ideas and some of the methodologies and approaches that focus on taking strategy and translating that into the designs of services. Okay, all right. It's a bit of a okay. I came across this essay many years ago when I was thinking about design coding and design coders. It caught my attention, and here Tim Brown, who's the former CEO of IDEO, talks about the merits of an evolutionary approach to design. He talks about how traditional design approaches may be necessary but not sufficient because they're static. He gives the examples of how even the most meticulously developed blueprint might fail because while it gives us a lot of confidence in our designs because we have so much of detail, we've scripted out the service every step of the way, every interaction of a customer or a user journey, and yet he talks about how amazing it is that many of these designs fail. And in this essay, he talks about perhaps, calls for designers to think in terms of code, software code, and genetic code, with the idea being that design expressed as code can more easily adapt and evolve over time, and perhaps have this more finer qualities of being able to create and specify instructions. It's a pretty good article, and he I think many years ago sort of put this idea out. And I'll show you today perhaps how that might even be possible, okay? But the key issue here is that when we're designing services, we're of course worried about things like producing the right outcomes and experiences, but in the end we also concerned about how these designs might fail in operations. Okay? All right. Services fail due to gaps and conflicts in their designs. Let me give what do we mean by that? Let me give you a couple of examples. So a few years ago, I went to a print shop. I had 40 copies of a document to be printed in color. Each document was 100 pages, and I negotiated a price, of course. I went to a FedEx office, print shop, and picked the paper, the colors were beautiful, and I paid for it. The user experience was fine. Everything went all right. They printed everything on time. It was easy. Check in, check out, paying for it. But when I went through all those copies, I found that some of those copies did not have the same richness and quality that I originally saw when I in the first few copies. What had happened was that, as you know, when they sent the print job, the toner in some of those printers was running low. But what was remarkable was that they didn't see that as a problem. It was almost like, well, every printer is different, and sometimes this happens. That was really the idea. So they've thought about how to the printing. The printing is done, the printing has worked, and yet someone didn't think about the idea that as you print large volumes, the toner might run out. It wasn't designed in the process. And also, most importantly, the idea was that, well, the documents are printed and sometimes it varies. So what's the problem? So this highlights the idea that no matter how much you think through about the entire process, the customer journey, the user experience, there might be one simple element, the aspect that how do you predict toner usage across copies of a document based on what the contents of the document. So that's an example of a gap that someone did not think about that. We didn't think of that. So that's just one example of what might be a gap in the design, and therefore from a customer's perspective, the service fails because that's what I paid for. I paid for all 40 copies to look exactly the same and be of high quality. An example of a conflict could be, let's go to a whole different example. Like, for example, dating apps like Tinder. What's the incentive for Tinder to match you as soon as possible to someone you like if they're not able to make money? So there's a certain inherent conflicts of interest in how quickly a dating app wants to match you and then cancel your subscription and get out from there, because there's an incentive in keeping you there as long as possible. So you pay for the premium versions because your matches are not as good or your options are not as good. But you see how it plays out, right? There's an inherent conflict of interest in you using a service like that and immediately matching with someone because they won't make money. And this conflict of interest thing is inherent in every service. You just have to look harder, whether it's Twitter altering your feed or a physician prescribing unnecessary treatments because that's how they're incentivized. So this is a key challenge. And sometimes the conflict of interest also exists within the customer. So as a customer, you do not want to pay $500 for a flight on a legacy airline, but as a user on Brian Air, you are like, oh, I really wish I did. So there's a conflict internally within being a customer or a payer as well, and between being a user. So user experience conflicts with the outcomes that you're willing to pay for. So those are some of the examples, okay? Just to give you an idea of what I mean by gaps and conflicts in the designs. This problem is less apparent or less severe in, say, for example, manufacturing. So here's a beautiful design. It takes a lot of time, a lot of iterations, and it works. It works from many different perspectives. But what manufacturing has it easy in a certain sense is that they have something called the bill of materials. So it's much easier to resolve gaps and conflicts because you're thinking in terms of fits and tolerances. There's a certain hierarchy. You have systems and subsystems, and you can pretty much more readily see where there might be a gap or a conflict, whether in terms of weight and speed or rigidity and shock. So those are the things that are much easier in the manufacturing world because we're able to visualize designs more readily. We see how all the parts fit together. Indeed, we can more readily figure out what all the parts are. That is a big challenge in services because what do services? How do I come up with a bill of materials for services? Okay, because what does the design of a service even look like? And that's really the big sort of leap of imagination one has to make to imagine services in a way which we're not used to seeing. So traditionally, we see services as these journeys, and we come up with pretty elaborate and meticulous blueprints, as Tim Brown points out, and yet things go wrong. So if you could, use a leap of imagination. Imagine that every service, no matter what kind, has exactly 32 structural elements. Why 32? I'll show you. But imagine this is indeed the case. This is sort of like a digital twin of the physical reality of a service. So no matter what kind of a service it is, imagine it has exactly 32 parts. And these 32 parts allow you to think through every possible thing that has to go through, that you have to put into the design so that all the parts come together in this condition of harmonious, orderly interaction. So this is the idea of strategic design. It's a certain level of abstraction where you are, of course, mindful of the physical realities and the dynamics and structures, but you're also thinking in terms of how all of these things fit together to form a whole that is other than the sum of its parts. So that's the basic underlying philosophy behind how to see strategy and design in services. For this, we use a technique or a format called the strategic narrative. Now, stories and storytelling are pretty common and prevalent in many different disciplines. But the idea of a strategic narrative is that having a story that communicates the strategic design of a service, but not just any story. The story has to have certain qualities. It has to be clear, concise, and complete, so it can be instructive. It has to have a certain level of coherence. And most importantly, the idea of a narrative is important because when you're designing a service, okay, or when you think of a service, whether it's garbage disposal or waste removal, or whether it's health inspection, or surgery, or transportation, each of these services require many different disciplines to come together. Okay, and it's not just, we talk about design, the process of design needing to be broad and inclusive to make sure you have many different perspectives that come together. So what we see is that the story format is the one format that everybody can really relate to. You don't have to teach people how to read or write a story. So this is the idea behind expressing design as a narrative, which then drives all the other artifacts that you might have to still develop, everything from process flow charts, detail engineering drawings, to contracts and user agreements and interfaces and all of those things. But the narrative is something that can bring together many different disciplines. Okay, and let me show you an example. So this is an example of a strategic narrative. It's as I mentioned, it's at a high level. It's a high level concept, and it expresses why a grocery store plays a significant role in the lives of people, allowing them to pursue certain lifestyles and diets, putting things right there wherever you need them, making it easy for you to get in and get out. So, for example, the story talks about what's not in the kitchen is in the cart within minutes of deciding what to make. No, so, by the way, this story changes quite a bit in a post-corona crisis, but that's the idea of a strategic narrative. What's the essence of the service? How do you even tell a story that brings in the customer and the provider and the particular decisions you make to be not just a grocery store, but a grocery store of a particular type? Okay. Now, what's different about this strategic narrative, the particular characteristic of this narrative is that it has exactly 16 sentences, not 14, not 12, not 55. It has exactly 16 sentences. And every sentence maps to one of the 16 elements of design you find in every service. So earlier I mentioned 32 parts. So the 32 parts are joined together to form the 16 elements. So this is the idea of developing a strategic narrative, making the 16 high-level statements, declarative statements, each statement being an opportunity to frame and encode strategy, make a choice, make decisions. And that's how, when you look at this, what you see on the right-hand side is sort of like a puzzle. So imagine a Sudoku of statements instead of numbers. You're solving this puzzle. You're having discussions, so that as you craft every statement, you are making a choice. You are basically formulating strategy, and you're encoding and expressing it through these statements. And that's how, when you solve this puzzle, you get what's on the left, which is a narrative or a script. So think of this as a synthetic story. You synthesize a story by solving the puzzle. And the puzzle looks something like that. It happens to be something called a Latin square. So you see these you see these threads going on over here, or sequences, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. You see them over here. So this is basically, they represent what is called, prospect, potential, actual, material, or in simpler language, who, why, how, what. So you're asking these very fundamental questions of who's making this promise, why are they willing to able to make it, how will the promise be kept, and what will the other side expect. So these questions are asked both of the customer and the service provider. So what you have is, you have these statements, and this is how you resolve gaps and conflicts, right? So these 3 statements, for example, in overlap or lock with these 4, and that's one way to resolve a gap and also to identify a conflict. So when you join these 2 statements, you get that one, and similarly, when you join these 2, you get that one, and these are what you will see later on called the 4 promises. So this is the idea of resolving gaps and conflicts at the strategic level, so that the detail, design does not suffer from from flaws or major structural flaws that causes your service to fail. Okay, it's a very different way of looking at what service is and the designs of services. Why this matters is that design is the ultimate expression of strategy. It is through design you express strategy. Design is this, attention to detail, the meticulous detail that Imran talks about. But now we're seeing design as this thing that codifies or encodes intent, okay, that is reflected in operations. And I say ultimate in the sense like as the final and the most sublime expression of strategy. And so using the word ultimate in both ways. The final is literally, one way to think of it is that your customers suffer your strategy through design. Same with your operations. So expressing strategy through design is a very critical aspect. Design is the language for expressing strategy, okay? Design helps reduce risk in operations. Strategy, by definition, tends to be bold and imaginative. You have ideas on how to change things and how to go to market or compete, or in the case of public services, we don't call it strategy, we call it policy, okay? So they're ideas, but they're risky. Their ideas have extreme uncertainty, so that's how the latter half of the diagram reads. So ideas are risky. There's deep level of uncertainty of how they might materialize, so they're extremely risky. So what you do is you turn ideas into concepts. So you progressively translate ideas to concepts to models, and models to scripts, okay? What I showed you earlier was an example of a script. It is a script of 16 statements. So what you do is you're translating strategy and you're progressively elaborating, adding detail, but in a manner that is continuous, so that nothing is lost in translation, new gaps and conflicts do not emerge. That's the basic idea of expressing and encoding strategy through the designs, okay? I'm going to show you a couple of key concepts and about how we go about doing it. These are the sort of concepts we're applying, for example, in the Digital Healthcare Initiative and at the Ministry of Defense. One of the first things we do is to get to the essence of what services are all about. So, and this involves using problem structures or patterns. Over the next few slides, I'm just going to show you examples of a couple of patterns. There are 8. I'm just going to show you a few of those just to give you a sense of what do we mean by patterns. Think of them simply as problem structures. They define the essence of something, or what a service is actually doing, or what the service is actually providing. So this pattern, for example, you can see in, for example, medical imaging, or any sort of an inspection, like this gentleman is inspecting samples of coffee and giving advice, monitoring services, or any service that ticketing system has to examine and evaluate, for example, what's on your card balance. Okay, so it's just an example. Another pattern would be repair and restore, repair, and in this pattern, you're really trying to restore things to their original condition and state, so therefore they can continue to be useful and valuable. So in this pattern, for example, you see everything from washing windows, recharging your car battery, or a judicial court restoring someone's rights or freedoms, or for example, in healthcare, where you recover a health condition. Okay, so my intention, just to give you an idea of the importance of analogical reasoning and problem structures. So that's another pattern, okay? And here's another one, display and display dispense. So all of these, the idea is to be able to look across an entire set of problems and to be able to divine or understand the nature of think of them as business models. So when you think of strategy, you also have to think in terms of what sort of models you're operating with. So you remember ideas and go to concepts, concepts to models. So this is the progression, okay? So being able to do that allows us to use a technique called stereotyping. So what you do is you frame the concept of a service by picking one of the two of the 8 patterns. Okay, so stereo simply means solid or stronger, as in 2, and type as in characterization. So here you have, for example, the stereotyping of something like border entry. Okay. And so it has 4 stereotypes. Each of them is a combination of 2 patterns. This is what I mean by stereotypes. So this is a combination of EE1 and DD8. And that's another one, TT4 and CC5. So what the stereotyping does is that gets to the essence of what this service must promise, and helps you break down value propositions and ideas into concepts that you can then build upon. So I can, for example, take the stereotypes of a border entry service, that of a content delivery network, okay? Just completely different different pattern structures. There's one in common. And then using that, for example, when I'm building something like medical imaging, I can look across and see innovative ideas or problems in other services that might occur in mine because they have the same underlying problem structures. So this is the value that a strategist brings from a design perspective. When in strategic design, you're really thinking in terms of the structural design. How can I best produce the value that we are promising, but also how do I be mindful of the underlying costs and risks that cause the services to fail, okay? So this is how the concept of stereotyping works. And then when you elaborate that, when you take each of those circles or dots on the stereotype, the profile, you translate them to something called 4 promises. So for example, I'll show you what it looks like. And this is just like a high-level overview, right? So this is a charging station. It's a service. When you elaborate each concept, for example, in this year, we are elaborating a single stereotype. So you see over here, RR3 restoring range, DD8 displaying supplying charge. So that's a combination. That's a stereotype that you saw in that grid. Now, each of that is then deconstructed into a set of 4 promises that define how the service would fulfill the promise of recharging a vehicle. And the important thing about the 4 promises is that 2 of the promises come from the customer side. So think in terms of our promises and counter promises, and that's what makes a service a whole. All of these 4 promises have to come together for this service to work. Now, from a strategy perspective, it's critically important what you're promising, because that's what you have to then make happen in operations. And if you're familiar with the whole notion of co-producing and co-production, this is the reason where we have 2 of the promises from the customer's perspective. Okay, that's really the idea. And that's another example. That's another example. Okay, just to give you an idea that it works for any possible service. So this allows us to not only profile services. So this is an example we're doing in the healthcare example. So we're stereotyping all of the services. So we have an understanding of when you introduce each service into the ecosystem, what are the underlying costs and risks, okay? Then this gives us our sort of like a game plan. So I mentioned that we are launching a whole ecosystem of services. We have 28 organizations from around the world coming together and trying to make this happen. So what we're doing is, this is our high-level game plan. We have a philosophy, or what we want to see in this market or in the ecosystem. We translate that into concepts or stereotypes, so that, in other words, for each of our services, we create a system profile. And that system profile translates into a set of promises. And it's those promises that we translate into scripts. Now you have some idea what this matrix means. It's the 16 elements found in each of those services. So each of the 4 promises is elaborated into the 16x narrative. 4 into 4 is 16. Who, why, how, what, 4 promises. That's how we progressively elaborate. So you see, we're in each step of the way, as we're elaborating, we're making sure there's no room for a gap to emerge or a conflict to emerge, because we're resolving the conflict using the puzzle structure. So our intention then is to produce these design dossiers that then provide detailed guidance and implementation for anybody who wants to enter the market. So this is a very new approach, and this has never been done before, which is why we find it so exciting. But yeah, that's really a whole new approach to design, strategic design, when it comes to services. Okay. And what you see over here, okay, so this is just a sample, just to give you an idea, part of what gets many of us going is that we're trying to constantly extend the range of possibilities, what we can do with our thinking and tooling. So this is what excites us. This is what the Design Coders group is all about. So what I'm going to show you next is that we're already taking this thing to something called 32x. So here, instead of solving a 16-piece puzzle, we're solving 32 pieces. So each piece of the puzzle is still a statement, and each statement has always an argument and a counter argument. So what we're doing is that because we're launching an ecosystem in such a difficult or regulated market, we want to make sure that our designs don't fail. So for each of the services, we're creating the script. It has 32 arguments and counter arguments. And that's when we can be sure that those design dossier will not suffer from what Tim Brown talks about, having very detailed and complicated scripts that anyway go and fail because we forgot about something. So in any puzzle, it's the basic nature of any puzzle is you're eliminating gaps by filling in numbers or words or letters, and you're resolving conflicts. So use your imagination of solving this puzzle so that you literally give each of your strategic design is literally one page. Now, each of the statements can then be blown up or elaborated into like a journey map or a layout of a facility, whatever it might be, that comes later. So each statement in this narrative then becomes a high-level instruction, okay? So that's what we mean by how to translate and encode and express strategy through the design of a service, okay? I hope I'm not going too fast. I have, I think, just one more message to give, especially given the context and the conference. And this is the idea that outcomes are what we pay for, okay? Or outcomes are what customers pay for, and experiences are what they pay with. And I know typically we don't see experiences this way, but just, flip it on its head. Think of the idea that by improving experiences, okay, nobody goes and gets an MRI scan because the experience is amazing, right? You don't hop onto a plane because it's a beautiful experience. Well, that is great because that's what you want. You want to suffer less effort and more ease. But in the end, you're really paying for the outcomes, and by improving experiences, you're reducing the burdens and the tedium or the transaction costs involved. And that's the notion of how designing better experiences can reduce what people pay over and above the price. A simple example could be 2 flights, okay, exactly the same outcome. The duration is also the same. Taking off and landing at the same airports, right? And so it's essentially they provide exactly the same outcome. On the same day, they're flying and pretty much arriving within minutes of each other, and they have very different pricing. And we make these choices based on which airline is easier or better or less painful to fly with. So this is one way to understand through airline pricing why experience is what you pay with because of the extra burdens an airline might place just in return for a cheaper fare. And one way to relate these things is that think of O as the quality of outcomes, P as the price, and E as the quality of experience. Let's go a little bit back to high school arithmetic. The P by E ratio is the transaction cost or the burden. It's a fraction. If you reduce the quality of experience, which is E, right, then the overall value of this fraction goes up. So in other words, you're subtracting more from the quality of outcomes, and therefore, the net value you get is much lower. So that's the reason why sometimes it's better to pay a higher price for a better quality of experience and have the same net value. And this is one of the strongest arguments one can make on how the designing of experiences can help the strategy, whether that of an airline, a bank, or a hospital, because it helps you deliver a higher net value for the same price, or any combination thereof. That's the basic of how you relate the designing of experiences to delivering better and superior outcomes. In the case of government, because price is fixed and often meant to be kept low, then it becomes all the more important that you deliver a higher quality of experience, because then you have to still give people a higher net value as far as possible. Okay, so that's the basic idea and this is at the strategic level, right? You as a strategic level, you have three levers, and you perhaps hold one of the most important levers, which is the quality of experience. Okay, and this is important because even in the case of Uber, which famously subsidized every single ride to the tune of about a few dollars for years. The reality is that to deliver the quality of experience that Uber and Lyft and others have promised, it is expensive. If Uber really passed on all the cost of producing that quality of experience to its passengers, they would in fact be costlier than taxis. So this is just a very sort of reality check. Okay, so quality of experience costs money. So how does it fit into your strategy? Is it raising investor cash and burning it through just to kill competition? Or is it possible to deliver a quality of experience at a lower price? So never, ever forget that pricing matters, okay? And this is something you have to keep in mind if you really want to engage upstream with decisions regarding strategy. And sometimes, what is even quality of experience? So here's a person getting arrested. It's a service provided by governments, municipalities. It's a taxpayer-funded services. In fact, everybody in this picture is probably paying for the service. So what is the outcome? What's the experience? Can you cancel the service just because if your experience was undesirable? So I just encourage you to think broader in terms of the meaning of whether it's user experience or interaction design, whatever it is. It's always important to understand things at a broader context, so that when you're confronted with challenges, then your thinking can be much more deeper and not fail because you're confronted with an example like this, like, well, what is the experience of being arrested? Okay, I think that's all I have for today. Hopefully I didn't go over my time. This is the book I've written. This is where you can see stuff like what I've covered, patterns and the 4 promises. And this is the Slack group. Join us, help us take these ideas further. Okay? Thank you very much. X out.